folks that are watching on a couple of blogs, The American Strategist, my own blog, The Washington Note. We're doing some live streaming today as well over the New America Foundation website. I've got a lot of great friends here today, and there are many great friends of the Senator. I'd like to highlight a few, but we don't have time because I want to give the Senator enough time to address some very important themes in his new book, America, Our Next Chapter, Tough Questions and Straight Answers. I wrote on my blog one time that he needed to work with me on better titles in the future, because I wanted to call this book something, No False Choices, or Asking Questions is Not Unpatriotic, something along those lines. I have all sorts of edge that I'd like to give Senator Hagel's talks, but he gives edge to his own remarks all the time. Of course, he's Nebraska's senior senator, and he's been a real conscience in the arena of American foreign policy and national security issues. I'm going to skip the traditional introduction of him and just share a few things that I have gleaned in my own admiration and respect for the Senator. He is, there was a story written by John Judas about the Hagel brothers, particularly about his brother Tom, with whom he served in Vietnam. A lot of his experience with Tom comes out in the book, and how Tom had become somewhat of an opponent to that sort of exercise ever being deployed again and visited on the United States. And Chuck Hagel was in a different political stripe and thought that wouldn't happen again to the country, and has been in a different groove. And the story of the brothers essentially is fascinating. There's another brother named Mike who's a painter, and I happened to be sneaking up to see some of Senator Hagel's staff, I think it was Rex and you and others, and took note of all the Eisenhower paintings and portraits. And there's a great painting of Dwight Eisenhower, a small one in the foyer of Chuck Hagel's office, and then a much larger one, which I've actually gotten a picture of and put on the Washington Note, that Mike Hagel painted, and it brought to mind that to some degree what Chuck Hagel is he's sort of bringing back and channeling, if you will, some of the decision making and the approach to national security questions that Dwight Eisenhower brought to the task. And when I say that, some people's eyes glaze over and say, what do you mean? Eisenhower did something that's not well recognized by a lot of Americans and even students of foreign policy, because it was classified until just a number of years ago. When Eisenhower came into office, he came with people like John Foster Dulles and others who really despised George Kennan and despised Truman, despised the doctrine of containment, and they wanted to roll in a different direction, roll the Soviets back and take to somewhat, a very, very direct collision course, nuke them now and get it over with approach to the Soviet Union and its behavior. And Eisenhower instinctively knew that this was wrong. But how do you convince your own party, your own people, your own personnel, your own generals, and your own intelligence chiefs to move differently? And he conducted an exercise called the Solarium Project, in which he assigned teams to compete over 5 weeks to think about and systematically think through the costs and consequences to American foreign policy for the worldview that they represented. And then, before a group of about 80 to 90 of national intelligence people, they had to present their case and look at the long-term consequences to the country. And when he did that, and he presided over that, it became very, very clear that continuing some form of containment at that time in American history was the only sensible strategy for the country. And what that was important for is it brought a discipline and at least thinking through the options to the questions that faced the country at a very, very important time. And it is that process for which I'm so thankful to Senator Hagel, because he's brought back a discipline, throwing all the options on the table, thinking through various scenarios, and not prejudging them, and saying we need to think through the costs and consequences of these different issues. So seeing the Eisenhower painting on his wall was just captured it for me. He is, as I've written before, the missing piece of the current presidential contest. There is no one, neither in the McCain nor the Obama nor the Hillary Clinton campaigns, that represents, in my view, the kind of judicious realism and thinking that I think Chuck Hagel brings to the table. And I was disappointed when he chose not to run to the president for the presidency, but I'm very much looking forward to whatever he decides his next phase is going to be, because I'm sure he'll continue to work for all of us as best he can on these issues. So without further ado, please help me welcome Chuck Hagel.
Steve, thank you. As always, I'm grateful that you would give me an opportunity to share some thoughts. And I'm particularly always enriched and enhanced with my former colleague, Congressman Dave McCurdy, sitting here, because many of you know of Congressman McCurdy's distinguished service to our country in the Congress and the responsibilities he led in many areas, but in particular national security and intelligence. And David, good to see you again, and thank you for what you've done for our country. I would say at the outset, in the interest of full disclosure, that I'm an admirer of Steve and his foundation and what you do here, because I believe it represents a bigger picture, wide lens view, 21st century framework of where America needs to place itself in this new universe of competitive nations and regions with great diffusions of power now in play. And I want to address some of that here in a few opening comments and then open it up to question and answers. I appreciated Steve's commentary about my brothers. I'm the oldest of 4 boys, and of course never was given appropriate respect by any of my brothers, and especially my brother Tom, who is 2 years younger than me. He is a law school professor at the University of Dayton, a municipal judge in Dayton, Ohio, and Cincinnati, Southern Ohio. Frightening thought, actually, that my brother would be dispensing justice anywhere. Probably more frightening is that his older brother is a United States Senator, which he acclaims often. But in those interpersonal relationships with siblings, which almost everyone is part of and is always enhanced as well through the advice that you get. My brother Tom, years ago, once gave me some very good advice, and that was that you should never seriously thinking about writing a book unless you have something to say. And it was his delicate way of saying you have nothing to say, and you should not embarrass yourself nor the family with projecting something out there that's, even though you have made a good part of your life in Washington, even people in Washington can see through a certain amount of fog and mist occasionally. But eventually they will get it. And I have always taken that piece of advice to heart, and I, over the years, like so many people in this room, certainly Dave and Steve and others, have written op-eds, and I've written speeches, I've written a lot of different things. And I never really believed I had enough in me for a book, wasn't sure if I had a chapter. Until about a year and a half ago, as I, like again many of you, travel around the world and meet a lot of people, and you try to keep your receivers tuned on more than your transmitters. And I think our world, especially this place in Washington, would be a hell of a lot better off if we had more receivers turned on and shut some of the transmitters off. But nonetheless, we are Washington. And it evolved into a point, an observation for me, that I had rarely seen the composition of the future, of issues, of challenges, society, the world, in a cogent, lucid form of how they are all interconnected, how all these great challenges of our time are now woven into one fabric. And you can take any one of the challenges that we would inventory, and if you inventory, say, a dozen challenges that each of you think are the big challenges, they would most likely all fit certainly within some framework. It may not be exact, but it certainly would be things like energy, the environment, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, extremism, terrorism, maybe the most difficult to deal with, insidious of all, despair, because within that framework is hunger and poverty and all the things that go with that. And I thought if we were going to inventory those in a way that made some sense, we should connect solutions to those. But my main point was to try to write something that, in fact, framed these issues and presented these issues in a clear understanding that they're all interrelated. You can't talk about energy without talking about the environment. You can't talk about the environment without talking about energy. You can't talk about either one of them without talking about the economy. And you can't talk about those three things without talking about stability in the world, security, oil, trade, relationships, alliances. And you just keep broadening and broadening until you have an entire quilt that has been associated and knitted and framed and weaved and quilted together with all these issues, even our entitlement challenges that we have in this country. We know, for example, not because I say it, but the actuaries are clear on where entitlements are going. I'm at the front end of the baby boom generation. We're going to load 77 million new people on in the entitlement rolls over the next 10 years. Social Security, Medicare, we know we're going to crush the system. We know we can't sustain that system the way we now are using it. We know the money won't be there. And so you can connect entitlement reform to trade, to our competitive position in the world, to our economic position in the world, to all that is part of generating a thriving economy that presents jobs and opportunities and tax revenues and all that has to fund a government, fund entitlement programs. So you don't disconnect, you can't disconnect any of these from all the bigger picture. Now, I think the next president of the United States is going to be confronted with an inventory of challenges and problems and issues like probably no other president. But I also believe within that framework of those challenges comes a tremendous opportunity. And that's going to require a 21st century frame of reference to house the challenges and the responses to these challenges, and how then we go about dealing with these great new issues that are now all global. They are not domestic. And when we look at the world today, almost 6.5 billion people, all of us part of a global community underpinned by a global economy. We're not going to unwind that. We're not going to go back to 1955 or 1960 or 1990. It is what it is, and it doesn't do much good to pick on the Chinese or anyone else and say, well, they have this trade balance surplus, or we're doing too much over here or too little, and we need to make sure that these people aren't doing this. That's the wrong approach. That's the wrong answer, in my opinion, to deal with the challenges ahead. We should be embracing a better world. We should be embracing more prosperity in the world, because if for no other reason, it represents more stability in the world. When countries are economically developing, problems with that, sure. Everything's imperfect. Standard of living for people are improving. With that comes understanding. With that comes engagement, exchanges of different opinions, tolerance, education, security, stability. All of the things that we think are important in a world that isn't going to be any less populated. We are headed to 9 billion people on the face of the earth. And when you look at the demographics of the 6.5 billion people today, you note that almost 40% are under the age of 19 years old. Now, what does that mean? Well, first, it means that we have a world out there that doesn't know who America is. And that's reflected quite clearly, unfortunately, in every measurement of a poll number. Most of the world today has a very unfavorable opinion of the United States of America. So Americans say, well, how could that be? We're good people, decent people. we contribute, we pay prices, we're at the United Nations, we have our peacekeeping forces, we're doing what we can to bring democracy to the world. How could this possibly be? Well, one reason is you've got a generation out there that now is dominated by this younger generation in the world that was not around during World War II, wasn't around after World War II. And so their image, their optic of the United States is Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and kicking down doors and occupying countries and the military side of who we are. Now you can say that's fair or unfair. That's quite frankly irrelevant. What's relevant is it's there. Not because I say it, but every poll number tells you that. Zogby's poll 2 weeks ago, more than 8 out of 10 people of 4,000 respondents interviewed in the Middle East have a very unfavorable opinion of the United States. That's a reality. First part of my book, I deal with what I refer to as reintroducing America to the world. Because if we lose the next generation of the world, these problems will become so big and so deep, then we will not be able to deal with them. They will be that big. And they are close to being that big now. And that 40% of the population of the world today under the age of 19, they reside mainly in the most troubled areas of the world. These are the areas that were left behind over the last 60 years. When we collectively, most of the developed countries in the world, led the world into the most historic advancement for mankind the world's ever known. Measure that by any field of endeavor, science, medicine, technology. But the troubled areas of the world are the areas that were left behind. They didn't realize benefit from any of those, starting with individual freedoms. And they have been locked into a cycle of despair. And we know that when man is without dignity, not much else matters, but we do also know there'll be a consequence to that. I don't necessarily connect terrorism with poverty. But we do know when people are locked in this cycle of despair, then there will be groups and people and those who would prey on these individuals and use religion, use other strange philosophies, extremist philosophies about government, about the world. And we know that the outcome is not positive. We know that. We don't know exactly how it all happens or fits, but we do know that those consequences are not going to be good for the world, certainly good for America. And those are areas we're going to have to focus on. But we can't do that without understanding the larger context of the kind of world that we're in now. I think the world that we're in now, the time in which we live, is as transformational as any in the history of man. Now, I wasn't around for all those years, but I do read a little bit, and I get around the world a lot. I listen. And I also began the first part of my book by talking about and quoting an individual that many of you have read his work over the years, Arnold Toynbee, who maybe was the greatest chronicler of history of all time. And one of the books that Toynbee wrote, The History of the World, a large book, many of you have probably read it. It has a lot of pictures, a lot of maps. I could negotiate it, mainly because of that, but I was able to read some of it. And I quote from Toynbee because I think some of his comments when he wrote that book years ago are very relevant to today. And he talked about civilizations, the 24 civilizations, and what's happened and why that they were disregarded. And he says such things as civilizations are movements. They're not conditions. They're journeys. They're not harbors. Civilizations die from suicide, not murder. Particularly relevant when we think of the capacity we have to destroy mankind with nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction and the environment, if we're not paying attention here. Then he says something, and I noted this here a couple minutes ago, that it summarizes it all. And he said, in the life of a civilization or a society, a country, a government, a people, individuals, there is one consistent, constant dynamic, and that's the dynamic of challenge-response. Challenge-response. And every one of us in our lives daily, we deal with challenge-response, and so do governments, so do institutions. How we respond to the challenges of our time, obviously, frame the future for any of us. And if we keep making mistakes over and over every day, then our future is probably not very bright. And we are at that point in history, I think. We are at that point in the world where we can go in different directions here. I still believe it's within the capacity of our country and the world to still make wise choices and wise decisions. I think we're getting closer and closer to the time when we fall over the edge. If for no other reason, then the margin of error now is very, very thin on everything. The recovery time from bad decisions, bad policies, certainly technology, has given us this world of immediacy. Everything is immediate. I talk in here a little bit about presidents and leaders. I would prefer, for example, if a president of the United States would just look out the window for 3 or 4 hours by himself and think. Wouldn't that be something? And actually have leaders think rather than this manic running around and holding press conferences and being an expert on everything, and you babble, and we all do, and know very little about what we're talking about, but the microphone's there. We're expected to know everything about everything. So we run out here, and we're really not leading. We're not being present. We're not being a center unless we're touring a factory or we're on a horse or making a fool of ourselves on something. That's not leadership. I know, as has been noted here, that President Eisenhower over the years has been, even in some occasions by some people, derided. But well, what did he do? He was quiet. He golfed, or he wasn't out there. Well, I don't need to recite President Eisenhower's accomplishments. More to the point, maybe, what he didn't let happen. What he didn't let happen. And I think the more historians reflect on the Eisenhower years, that may be his most significant contribution to the world. What he didn't let happen. Story in the Washington Post today, some of you saw it, about when all of his advisors and his military people said we need to use tactical nuclear weapons against China to protect those straits near Taiwan, Quemoy and Matsu. And of course, if you remember, that was a big campaign deal in 1960. He went against his own people on that, the episode that Steve noted. That's the kind of leadership I think we need today. I think that's the kind of leadership we will get. Democracies have a wonderful way to self-correct, and it's called elections. And elections do it. They're imperfect, and institutions, as we know, are imperfect. We're all imperfect. But the American people, most democracies do sort it out. And I talk about some of that in the book. The 16 chapters that I write in the book, as I noted earlier, are all about variations of what I have just noted, but I go into some specifics in particular areas. And I talk, for example, about Iraq in 2 chapters. And I didn't think I could write a book without really addressing Iraq. And I say some things in those 2 chapters that maybe a lot of people have not heard before. How did the resolution get written and who wrote it? I name names in it. Take my share of responsibility. I was there. I have a chapter called Where Was the Congress? I think Congress has abdicated its responsibilities almost historically the last 5-6 years. I think we're coming back. I think that was partly what the 2006 election was about, when the American people threw the Republicans out and brought the Democrats in. Same kind of thing in 1994, when the Democrats were thrown out of power and the Republicans were brought in. We weren't in war. We were a different situation, but it's the same thing. But I talk about, in great detail, Iraq. I talk about the Middle East in one chapter, about our relationship with China, our competitive position in the world. I talk about entitlements. There's a chapter in there I also focus on citizenship, because I think one of the great challenges we have today in this country is reconnecting our young people with civic responsibilities. It's not their fault. We have failed them. I mean, how many schools in the country, for example, teach civics or just a basic knowledge of government? or the responsibilities of citizens. Not many, not many. And that's just but a small part of it, but that's how you frame cultures and societies. Education is probably the most important part of that. But I talk about why we need to reconnect responsible citizenry to our country, and I think we can do that. I think we have a great generation of young people. I have a junior in high school and a freshman in high school, son and daughter, and they are part of that. And I see how they want to be part of something greater than their own self-interest. There's nothing wrong with these young people. More challenges, more issues that they're dealing with, and so on. That's an important part. I also talk in one of these chapters, who speaks for the rifleman? Because we in Washington tend to become so consumed with the abstractions of policy that we say go to war, 5 combat brigades we're going to put in Iraq, we're going to have a surge of 6 combat brigades. Well, what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means, those of you who've been to war. It means some people are going to die on our side. There's going to be a lot of people die maybe. That means some guys aren't coming back. Some will come back permanently scarred and maimed for life. Families will be ruined. People will be displaced. Great suffering everywhere. And all the other consequences. Now, sometimes, if that is the only option that a nation has, that's the only option a nation has. But you better be damn sure, before you commit a nation to war, and these people to go fight and die for something, that you know what you're doing. You better have that as the last absolute option that you have. And I wanted to bring some reality to all this in that one chapter. I have one chapter on politicians, and I'm a politician. I call it Crabs and Prairie Dogs. And those of you who've had a chance to read that chapter know that me being from Nebraska, I know about prairie dogs. I don't know as much about crabs, but I've observed them. And prairie dogs have a wonderful way, it's the only way they exist, is that they dart from hole to hole. And they'll get down the hole, and then they'll put their little heads up, and they'll look around. Is there any danger up here? Or is there any, if there's any danger, conflict, controversy, anything, their little heads go right back down in that hole. Then they scamper to the next hole. In a lot of ways, that's how we are, politicians. No danger, no controversy, we don't have any problems. And I got myself in trouble not too long ago when I announced at a committee hearing once, we were talking about Iraq, and I said to my colleagues, if you wanted to save jobs, you should have sold shoes. Well, some of the shoe people weren't happy with that, but I actually did sell shoes once, so I could take some license. But my point was, this is not a safe business. Leadership is not a safe business. It's a responsible business, but it's not safe. Then I end the book with one chapter that I hope I can put everything back together, and I talk about leadership, and I call that chapter My Mount Rushmore. And I use the people on Mount Rushmore, great leaders we've had, to kind of work our way through all of this and the contributions, important contributions they have made over the years, imperfect, each leader. And then it ends up with the point, if in fact we were building a new Mount Rushmore today, who would be on your Mount Rushmore? Would you keep the 4 presidents up there? Would you take them down? Would you add anybody or not? And I keep the 4 up there, and then I add 3 people. And I talk about why I add the specific 3 people, and I try to tie that back to the great challenges of our time. And the conclusion is that we are a nation, we are a people, we are a society up to this challenge. No generation of Americans has ever failed our country. Every generation of Americans has left our country better than they found it, stronger than they found it, with more opportunities for the next generation. That we have left the world better than we found it. All the mistakes we made were all imperfect, but the world, by any measurement, our country, by any measurement, has been left better, more tolerant, more full of opportunities, and I think freer, as well as other ways to measure societies and measure success or failure. So that's a little bit of the book and why I wrote it, and be glad to respond to questions.
Senator, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've arranged with Politics and Prose to have the books out for you, and they've already been signed. What the senators agreed to do for just a little while, there may be too many folks, and I'll apologize in advance of this, but he'll personalize as many as he can after we're done. But the chairman of New America's Directors Council, Rita Hauser, is a good friend of yours, a good friend of ours, and I'm trying to think of a question if she were here today that she might ask. And let me bring to one. I've read the book now a couple of times, and I highly recommend it. I don't like political memoirs, and I usually don't like what sometimes look like political memoirs that are sometimes vanity books. This is not a vanity book, and I say this very genuinely. It is a extremely well written and almost a painful journey through some of the questions and decisions you made about Iraq. There's a very cute vignette in there about you talking to or Joe Biden talking to your mom, I guess, and Rita Hauser, for instance, who chaired George Bush's campaign in the year 2000 in New York. And has since journeyed away from that for a lot of the same reasons you have. It reminds me of a picture on your wall, another picture on your wall, which I'll share. There's a picture of George Bush and John McCain and Chuck Hagel hugging each other. And if I remember the inscription from the president, it's kind of saying, who's the rose and who are the two thorns? But it's obvious how close you were to the president and maybe are to the president and to John McCain, and that the journey you talk about, particularly with regard to your decision on the Iraq War, was very tough. And I might like to ask you to touch on that. And also, what Rita would say is, why is this such a hard sell? In other words, why has there not been more accountability on the decision-making that has undermined America's national security portfolio, and not greater rewards for those who are trying to approach this strategically and differently?
Well, let me address President Bush and Senator McCain first, that relationship. I have always tried, and I know Dave's been the same way, and many of our colleagues, to never allow these political differences to get personal. And I really think that's important.
I think Dick Cheney feels the same.
There are some who don't subscribe to that theory, but I can only be accountable for my own actions. But thank you. And so my relationship with the president has always been personally very warm. I always respect my colleagues. Certainly I respect the office of the president, and I think everybody does. And so when I have a rather fundamental and significant difference, it's based on a policy matter and how I see the world versus a friend or a colleague. And I've always taken another approach too on these things. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm right, and I accept that. I accept that. But I've also, at the same time, a long time ago, just because we're all products of our experience and products of our environment, came to a realization that I think the most difficult thing to live with, if God allows you to live a long life, and hopefully productive and happy, is at the end of that period of your productive long life, and you are inventorying those years. I have never wanted to deal with regrets that come back and haunt you with this. I knew I should have said something. I knew I should have done something, but I didn't have the courage to do it at the time. I mean, we all live with regrets, of course, but that's the regret I don't want to ever have. So I'm never worried about being wrong. And hopefully I'm informed, hopefully I study issues and use the best judgment. But I never let it get personal, and I never worry about whether I'm absolutely right. I may be right, maybe I'm wrong. So that's how my relationship with the president has evolved over the years, and we're still very cordial, and when we see each other, I consider him a friend, and I hope he considers me a friend. McCain and I are very close personal friends, have been. I was his co-chairman of his presidential campaign in 2000. His office is next to mine in the Senate. Our desks are next to each other on the floor. I get combat pay for being next to him. But I admire John as much as I admire anyone. We have obviously a pretty fundamental difference here, but we're still talking about some of these things. Now, to your bigger question, I guess Rita's question, if she was here too, it seems to me you frame up the atmospherics always that surround decisions for a nation. And those atmospherics always dictate a certain amount of the dimensions and the attitudes of whatever decision's taken. And the atmospherics of our invasion of Iraq in March of 2003 were still very much the September 11, 2001 terrorist attack on this country, projecting a significant amount of fear, concern, uncertainty. I reference in my book the quote of Winston Churchill, the jarring gong of terrorists hitting this country. We then invaded, as you know, Afghanistan a couple of months later, if it was that. The whole atmospheric dynamic at the time going into Iraq was predicated very much on the acceptance by the media, by the Congress, by most of the American people, that we had to do this because Saddam was a threat to the security of this country. That's what the president said, that's what the vice president said, that's what our leaders were telling us. Vice President Cheney, for example, was very clear. He said, Vice President, Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of nuclear, possessed nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction. So, you take all of society, 300 million people, and you start moving them down in one direction because the president, people you trust, you should trust, and you're off balance anyway. The terrorists have hit this country once. We're in Afghanistan. We got to do something. This is a very clear choice here. This is in the national security interest of our country. Well, some of us tried to slow that down, and it's all on record. Not that I was the only one, but I think my record's pretty clear on that. What I had to say early on, and I took a lot of hits from my own party, my own state, a lot of my own friends that I was un-American, unpatriotic. How dare you question the president, our policy going to war, and so on and so on. Well, I didn't enjoy that. I didn't like that. But I just thought that was my job. Now, to Rita's point, I think you say, why is it such a hard sell? Well, what happens is, now in our 6th year, starting our 6th year in Iraq, 7th year in Afghanistan, there's always a settling of issues. It's like a settling of anything in our lives. The crisis, in one sense, is past to the extent that we're now given some time to reflect, to survey, to see what it is. And we now know that, in fact, much of what was told by this administration, the American people, was not true. I'll leave that up to the American people to decide whether it was intentional or not, and there are books been written already on this, and the historians will be clear on this. So, now, where are we with the American people? Every poll shows you that almost 70% of the American people think going to Iraq was a mistake. Almost 70% of the American people say we need to get out. Most say we need to get out now. So it does settle. And the last point I'd make on this, what is lost in something like this? A lot of things are lost. Over 4,000 American lives, thousands and thousands of Iraqi lives, and others, over 4 million Iraqis displaced, over 2 million displaced outside of Iraq, $13 billion a month still being spent in Iraq, the standing of America. So there is an entire arc of losses for this country. It will take us time to build back, doing great damage to our force structure, as General Cody said, Vice Chief of Staff of the Army 2 weeks ago. But what's really lost in something like this is the currency of trust of your government, the disconnect between the people and its leaders. And I'll end with this. I was on IMUS a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about one of the chapters in Iraq, and he wanted to probe this a little bit. And it was a good conversation. He was very respectful about it. And so I was telling him about the conversations I had with the president, with Colin Powell, who's a very good friend of mine, who I believe that this administration marginalized totally and minimized. The one guy who knew about war, the one guy who was trying to slow it down, the one guy who was blowing back on everybody they wouldn't listen to. And Colin's going to defend himself, speak for himself, but Imus was taking the point in the book about the day after the vice president gave the speech to the VFW at their national convention in August of 2002, and I called Colin the next morning. I said, Colin, these guys are going to war. I mean, it's very clear to me. Don't tell me anymore that they're not going to war. They aren't. And Colin said, no, the president has not made his decision yet. And I said, Cheney just gave a war speech yesterday. And he said, I know, I heard it, but the president has not decided on this. And I said, well, so I listened, and we back and forth. The question that Imus put to me, as I answered it, and was that, why, so on. Then Imus said this, but Senator, weren't you naive? And I said, it's an interesting question, Don, because what your question says, more than implies, is that how foolish of you as a United States Senator to actually trust and believe what the President of the United States and his people told you. I mean, is it naive to believe your president? Is it naive to believe the leadership of your country? That's what's lost, and that's what we're going to have to regain.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful and extensive response. We're going to try and gather a few questions now. I want to ask Congressman Dave McCurdy with the Automobile Manufacturers Alliance. We'll go first, and I'll grab a few other questions here.
Senator, first of all, I think everyone is here first to thank you for your leadership and your political courage, and we need more of that in this country, and I personally thank you. I also like your common sense and your willingness to speak out. I don't know, something about people who grow up in the plains, but there's something about that.
The Oklahoma boy.
Yeah, if you were advising the next president, regardless of party, and you've tried to, in your book, lay out some principles and framework. First of all, we all know this political process of electing president is not ideal. And if anything, it polarizes rather than unites a country. And the challenges that the next person has is going to be immense. But if you were advising them on the first couple of decisions with regard to, you can take Iraq as an example or any other tough political issue, how are they going to be able to get beyond the political rhetoric and the jarring experience of the campaign and actually deal with the reality, regardless of where they come to this position on Iraq, how do we actually preserve U.S. interests but do the right thing to advance the cause?
Well, I think that's really the essence of where we go in the next 4 years. Because if the president doesn't do, and I will answer your question, if the new president doesn't do what you just asked me the question, how would you advise him or her to do that, then this new president will be incapable of governing. Iraq, I think, is the centerpiece of this, and I think it is the defining dynamic, and if the new president doesn't immediately move towards some responsible unwinding of our involvement in Iraq, that president is not going to be able to govern this country the next 4 years. You cannot govern a country where the American people are opposed to a war policy or foreign policy which you can't sustain. I mean, that's obvious. Now, what do you do? At least what I would advise the next president to do, a couple of things. One, immediately form the smartest, wisest, best bipartisan cabinet you can find. Immediately. That not only is symbolic, but it is the formation of that governing council with the president. It's going to have to govern certainly for a couple of years, but it'll set the framework for the president's first 4 years. On a parallel track, that president needs to immediately reach to the Congress, bipartisan, Republican and Democrats, regardless of who's elected president, to bring them into the deal. The president, I think, should probably, the new president, take a couple of trips around the country and hold a couple of forums, reaching out. On another parallel track, I talk about in my book, Reintroducing America to the World. I think in the first 6 months, the president ought to take 2 or 3 foreign trips, reaching out to the world, enriching alliances, enhancing alliances, building these 21st century coalitions of common interest like Eisenhower, Truman, Marshall, all of them did. We can't beat terrorism. We can't do anything without those alliances. Intelligence gathering, sharing is a network of seamless sharing and gathering. You know a lot about that, David. Those are the things I would recommend the next president do.
You go to Chuck. Yeah. Just to save time.
Senator Don Kraus with Citizens for Global Solutions, and thank you, and I look forward to reading your book. Sir, I represent an organization whose members get it as you do, that we do live in a very interconnected world, that nations need to work together to solve the problems that they can't solve on their own. But one of our products that we put out on a regular basis is our Global Solutions report card, where we look at members of Congress and how they vote in terms of achieving those goals. How do we get to the point where we can actually have a more effective bipartisan foreign policy at the level of members of Congress who are making decisions, that there are many, many different votes, including one, sir, that you've made, and I've been a long-time supporter of yours, where it goes very much on party line instead of what seems to be best for achieving that goal of nations working together? Thanks.
Well, I think, again, it follows what I noted in my answer to Congressman McCurdy, framing a bipartisan government that is built to develop a consensus to govern. Now, there are going to be differences, and there's nothing wrong with differences. There should be differences, and that tension is healthy for all the reasons we know. But tension is only part of the process. It shouldn't dominate the process. It shouldn't be the end product of a process. Unfortunately, that's where we've been. We're locked in paralysis. There's going to have to be a consensus. That means some compromise. That means, what's the objective here? The objective is to start addressing these issues, and you talk specifically about a foreign policy. Well, one of the ways I think you do that is you reach out, the next president. You bring both parties, their senior people up, people who know something about the issue. Our Congress is full of very knowledgeable people about foreign policy, Democrat and Republican. No party has a corner on that. There will be differences, but you can sand those differences down. You can get over the top on some of those. And I think that's where you start. And it has to be real. It can't be fabricated. It can't be just symbolism. It can't be a photo op. But it's got to be real. And I'll give you a couple examples. When I first got to the Senate in January 1997, President Clinton had just started his second term. I was at the White House, I was at the State Department, I was at the Pentagon many times with Secretary Albright, Secretary Cohn, with President Clinton, Vice President Gore, the National Security Advisor, Berger. 2 or 3 Republicans were called up. Sometimes I was the only Republican called up. But we always had a bipartisan group in there. It was a small group. It wasn't a big cattle call. You just kind of check the names, and the president does his little dance. But actually, the president listened. The president would sit and listen for an hour, and then we all would have our own individual ideas, and we all come at this a little differently, and that's okay. That's what makes for better policy. But the last point I'd make on this, and Dave knows this, and anybody who's ever been in elective office, but anyone who knows anything about human relationships, and it's everybody in this room. Politics is about people. The lubricant that makes it work in the Senate or the House isn't exactly the same because it's more of just a straight power. If you got the votes, you got the power. Senate's different, for example, but still the same concept. Relationships are the lubricant that make it work. That kind of get those gears in sync. And you'll have differences. You'll have party positions. You've got a lot of pressures on a congressman and a senator and a president. You got your parties, you got your states, you got all the different, and then what you really think. And sometimes the stars are aligned. You actually can work them all the same way, the same time. But many times you're going to have to take a difficult stand on some of this. But if you have a relationship, it gets you a lot farther than if we don't. And that's what's broken down.
Terrific. In the very back.
David Smith from the United Nations office here in Washington, and Senator, many thanks, because I'm sure many people in the room will know that you've been a very good friend to the United Nations in recent years, and it hasn't always made you so popular with your own party. And the kind of friend, it should be said, who dares to tell you the truth, which sometimes you don't want to hear. Sir, you've raised the need to reconnect with the world, and you've told us very clearly that you're hoping that this campaign will be the mechanism, this election will be the mechanism to reconnect. I wonder if you see this campaign actually doing that, and whether you feel that the discussion is global, or whether it's become focused on Iraq, Afghanistan, the war on terror, quote, or whether it is the big picture campaign that I know you at the end of last year really felt we desperately needed. Thank you.
Well, I don't think up to this point it's been a particularly enlightening exercise, and that's partly due to the fact that it's been a primary, and primaries are intra-party, as you know, but still at the same time, the issues don't go away, and whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or entitlements, energy, environment, whatever, those issues are still going to be there over the next 6 months, and the new president's going to deal with them. I have to tell you, I've been disappointed. I've been disappointed in the squandering of the debates, the squandering of the kind of questions that the news media has asked. Candidates are captive to those formats, and I'm sympathetic to candidates, I suppose, because I was one, but both Democrat and Republican, I know these candidates would like to go far higher and wider and deeper into these big issues than some of these silly questions that they get asked. I mean, you must not be a real American because you don't have a flag in your lapel. I mean, that's interesting, but you know, I think most Americans don't believe that you need to have a flag in your lapel to be a good American, and it's that kind of silly mumbo jumbo stuff that we've squandered, and I put that on the media and those who have not done a very good job, I think, in that process. Now, what I think will happen is we'll get the other nominee established. The Democratic Party will pick whoever their nominee is. Then we'll have the two nominees. They'll be on a higher ground. We've got the two general election candidates. Then the big issues can be focused on in a more serious way, I hope, and the candidates will be focused on those. I don't think it's the candidates' fault on this. I think it's more the trivial, superfluous nonsense that dribbles out of the media most of the time. Surely any candidate for president's life is open. I mean, we get that. Your preacher, your bowling instructor, your coach, you know, whoever touched your life is, you know, it's fair game. But let's and that's fine. Let America know. But let's focus on how this prospective president will lead the country and the world. And I hope we'll get to that.
Right here. Last question. We'll wait for the mic. Get through. Full house today. Very quickly, Wolf.
Yes. Wolf Brookman here in Washington with the American Chamber of Commerce in Germany, and thank you, Senator. You've always been a good friend of AmCham Germany. I'd like to raise a difficult question of adapting international economic institutions to the new players in the global system. I'm thinking specifically of the G8, and I'm thinking specifically of a position taken by Senator McCain last week in his foreign policy speech, in which he indicated he would oppose Russia being a member of the G8. And as I understand it, would also not want to see China in the G8. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think it's up to the United States of America nor our leader to make that determination. I would disagree with Senator McCain's point simply because on the face of it, I don't think that's the kind of enlightened foreign policy for the 21st century you want to project. There's a process, a system. I have always taken the attitude on alliances, on international institutions, that generally it has benefited the world, bringing nations into those, if for no other reason, it gives some boundaries for nations to work within. Now, non-proliferation treaties are those they're out there who cheat on those, and are there cheaters? Are there always going to be cheaters? Yes, they're all imperfect. Yes, I know, I get it, but I've always subscribed to the larger context of these alliances, if they make sense, if countries can comply with the requirements for admission, that they're in the best interest of everyone, because they do shape a nation's behavior to some extent in complying with certain standards. And I think also there's a benefit of engagement, of relationships, of understanding, of a certain tolerance. Now, I don't think we're yet ready to, it wouldn't be my opinion, to say that definitely that China or Russia should be admitted to the G7 within the full range of responsibilities. However, I certainly wouldn't say that they shouldn't be. I think that's not an effective way to engage and encourage. It's like Turkey membership in the EU. Obviously, the United States is not a member of the EU. The EU will sort that out. But I just think there's so many intangibles as well as tangibles that come with nations joining relevant institutions that it's wise to keep those possibilities open. So I would disagree with Senator McCain's point. And I'll take one more question real quick.
Oh, I was going to.
You
don't have time. I've already gotten
it.
the signal. I apologize. We're going to have some of you spend time and pose your questions and some personal time with the senator out there. But I wanted to take a moment to just close. I've had an incredible and privileged opportunity to know people like Dave McCurdy and to travel with him and to get to know Senator Hagel and his team and others. I have to say that it's a privilege because there are a lot of other members of Congress that I've been able to spend some time with, and I won't mention names, where you realize that the two gentlemen up here, and particularly Senator Hagel today, have tried to make a very constructive difference. And one of the things that struck me about the book is I've been stalking him for a long time. He knows it. We were on opposite sides on the John Bolton battle. I've been trying to shake his staff up for a few years on a number of fronts. I've been trying to ferret out some letters. In fact, there was a letter, Rex on you knew about this case, where a letter that I had heard rumors of through a military command officer that Senator Hagel had sent to President Bush and Condi Rice about Iran and how important taking a different strategic direction would be. I called Rex up and I said, I need to see this letter. He says, how'd you hear about the letter? And it just so happened that Senator Hagel was going to be speaking for me that night, and he said, if you mention the letter, we'll have to leave. And then luckily Senator Hagel himself mentioned the letter, and then I was able to get it through alternative sources and out there. When you read this book, you will find moment after moment of vignettes when Senator Hagel weighed in on a decision that none of us really know about, that didn't hit the headlines or the blogs or weren't known about it. There were letters out there that weren't media moments. And I think this is one of the things that when you spend time with people who really want to make a difference in important national security issues and challenge the thinking of the White House or their colleagues, it's embedded in the book, and not everything is a PR moment, as you said, off being a factory or doing something like that. So I highly recommend that, because, and I want to appeal to the senator when he's putting his papers together as he regrettably leaves his office. There are a lot of letters referenced in that book that I haven't seen. And would love to help, in fact, in any way you'd like to bring them to the world. But I want to thank him on, with the question to my friend from the United Nations, with how to make difference on the John Bolton battle. It was very, very clear to me that Senator Hagel kept giving these speeches at Brookings and all over, and I would walk away and he would talk about no false choices between Israel and the Middle East, standing up and asking the key questions. I've been with Joschka Fischer sitting next to John Hamre from CSI. Something I said, I just heard Senator Hagel list the same questions Joschka Fischer did, and there were these moments where you would see his role early on. And I felt that there was not enough tension. And then the case, he would support John Bolton. And I said, how in the hell did he do that? Here this face of pugnacious nationalism in America returning versus sort of principled American engagement in world affairs. And that's when I recognized, John Bolton was my battle. His was Iraq and the bigger cosmic systemic issues. And he goes through that a bit in his book. And I have tremendous respect for anyone in those important roles that feel like they need to make that trade-off, because we're looking at one micro vote, Don, now and then, and we want them all to be these cookie cutters, and they're not. And this book gives you a feeling for how difficult and ripping to some degree being in those positions where you have to make a difference are. So I know that's a bit of a long-winded conclusion, but it was my way of saying thanks to Senator Hagel for just an outstanding job and of taking through it. So I recommend the book to everyone. I want to thank you very, very much for being here today.
Steve, thank you. If I could, I want to say two things very quickly. First, I want to introduce Frank Ricardoni, who's sitting there. Many of you know Frank. He was our just came back from Egypt, was our ambassador to Egypt, the Philippines. He's had so many big-time jobs for this country, one of the premier foreign service officers of our time. Frank, great to have you with us. Thank you. On the John Bolton issue, let me make one point, because you're always faced with different issues. John and I don't agree on a lot of things, obviously, and so it's a good question that you ask. But here's where I've come down as a senator in my 12 years on these kinds of things. I've always given the benefit of the doubt to the president, and I've always thought the president should have the team that he or she believes is right for him or her. He is the elected president, and I don't think Congress should get into micromanaging his people, unless there's such a glaring deficiency, somebody's in detox or criminal records, or certainly incapable. And I think in the 12 years I've been in the Senate, I've only voted against one senior level appointee of the president in the 12 years. And that's why I have always kind of approached it that way, because I think if the Senate gets into trying to micromanage a president's team, that's not good for the country. It's not smart, even though John and I have a lot of differences.
We respect that. When we were on the other side of that, we respected that, but we also appreciated your letting us have our ability to raise some of the key questions. It was it was a nice dance, and I just wanted to thank you for the role that you played in the John Bolton issue. But let me bring the senator out front. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you,
Chuck. Thank you.